We're going to hear from it's from Beatrice, who is from India. Her work, and she's going to talk about the EU's evolving legal and policy approaches to gender equality, a report on a new report from the European Institute for Gender Equality. Beatrice is a legal professional. It's a legal professional who specialised in international human rights law, violence against women and criminal law. She also currently serves as coordinator of the Legal Committee for Women's Declaration International. So thank you so much, Beatrice, for talking about this. I've been really looking forward to hearing what's going on, I suppose with trepidation, because I imagine it's going to be horrific, but over to you.
I'm going to be talking about the European Institute for Gender Equality. It is going to be a little bit of bad news because they are a completely captured institution, but we do have some reason for hope. So this is a fairly new report. It just came out a couple of months ago. The EIGE, the European Institute for Gender Equality, it isn't actually one of the bodies of the European Union. So it's important to remember that they're a think tank. They're situated in Lithuania, not in Brussels. But they do have a certain amount of influence in terms of setting the EU agenda. So they've been established to strengthen gender equality across the EU. They claim to be a European knowledge center on gender equality issues. The funny thing is, if you go to their website and if you look up sexism, they are able to say that, yes, sexism is about hatred against women and treating them as inferior and discriminating against them. But of course, at this point, they are a highly captured institution and their publications reflect that. So in this report, which came out a little while ago, they use all of the normal tricks. They talk about intersectionality. They talk about how, in order to really bring about equality between men and women, we have to use everything at our disposal, that it is far more complex, and says that the current legal framework is not sufficiently intersectional. Here's the funny thing. They cite Article 19 of the TFEU, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, and claim that existing legislation does not, in fact, comply with Article 19 of the TFEU. This is a little interesting because Article 19 of the TFEU does not have the word gender in it. So it's very, this is exactly where they try to reach, because how many people are actually going to try and look up what exactly the Article 19 originally said and what it's been interpreted as. So because they say it is not compliant with Article 19, but then they also go on to claim that Article 19 is insufficient because it does not use the word gender, it uses the word sex. Now, as far as the European Union is concerned, Article 19 is important because it's in this main treaty. It's in the TFEU, which pretty much determines what kind of directives, what kind of regulations come out of the European Union. And because this does not mention gender, this poses a problem for them. They also then go on to call to swiftly deblock negotiations on the proposed Horizontal Equality Directive. The Horizontal Equality Directive is a proposal that does include the word gender, and it includes a lot of the other loose language that we're sort of used to seeing now as being used to push gender ideology. They consistently push the boundaries of EU law. Now, like I said, there are a few good things, is that most of hard EU law does not actually use the word gender. There is the directive on equal treatment in occupations, and there's a directive on equal treatment in terms of benefits, and both of those use the word sex. This, again, does not really help them. So they cite the EU LGBT survey to claim that gender is now, sex is now understood in a more wide sense. And they also say, well, there is a shift. They say they acknowledge that there has been an expansion from the time that the original articles on equality in EU law were drafted. And their claim for this source is, of course, one of the documents is the EU LGBT survey. Now, as we know, a lot of the EU countries have come up with self-ID laws, kind of recognition laws, which are very much not in favor of women, but they don't have that much of substantive support in hard and the most high-ranking EU law, so to speak, because the directives really kind of rule in terms of the EU superstructure. However, there is something called the Victims' Rights Directive, which was passed in 2021. That uses the word gender-based violence and is defined as violence that is directed against a person because of that person's gender, gender identity, or gender expression, or that affects persons of a particular gender disproportionately. You can kind of see how very confused they are because they use all four of these concepts separately. Gender, GI as separate, gender expression as separate, and apparently there's another category of gender, which just makes no sense. You cannot have four different concepts lined up like this in anti-discrimination law. It simply collapses under incoherence. They claim that Council of Europe experts pushed the expansion in the gender equality concept. That is to a certain extent true. There have definitely been writers, commissioners, EU politicians who have pushed it. And predictably, they quote the latest report of the UN Special Rapporteur on, not Special Rapporteur, independent expert who does not have the same status as a Special Rapporteur on sexual orientation and gender identity. And they quote this other nonsensical line that's on my slides, which is broadly relating to how gendered societies and related constructs and expectations can influence personal identities and in social interactions. Now, this is a great line as a form of speech, but from a legal perspective, this makes no sense because this is not precise. It is not limited in any way. And Madrigal Bolos he feels quite confident pushing this. And of course, we have been trying to respond to this on that level as well. They basically argue that the shift has occurred. The interesting thing is that they do acknowledge the existence of opposition in this report. They do say there has been an increase in so-called anti-gender movements, but they argue that there has been this expansive shift in the concept of gender equality, that it now accounts for manifestations of discrimination on the grounds of gender identity and gender expression, and they argue that this has happened quite organically. What I did find interesting is that they primarily cite case law from the Court of Justice of the European Union, and that in turn quotes the European Court of Human Rights. I think most listeners here by now will be familiar with the infamous case of Goodwin from the European Court of Human Rights, which really sort of paved the way for the Gender Recognition Act in the UK itself. So this involved a case of a man who underwent surgery, claimed to be a woman, and he was in a relationship with a man and couldn't marry because he couldn't change his birth certificate. So under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, on the right to family life, he filed a case in the ECHR and won. And the ECHR said that in denying legal recognition to him, they were frustrating his right to a family life. But it's interesting to see that all of this again comes back to the fact that same-sex marriage was not allowed, because if that had been the case, the necessity for this case would not have arisen. He still had his original birth certificate, and a male could not marry another male. And that's why this route was resorted to, as saying it's because I can't be recognized as a woman that I can't get married. But the core of the problem in Goodwin and in a lot of the cases that followed, which pretty much starts the mess legally in the European sphere, is because of the lack of marriage equality. It's also interesting, I'm not sure if this has been covered before, but of course, in the ECHR decision, they do highlight that because gender identity is now a recognized medical condition, and given the state of medical knowledge on this, that the court in that case said it is wrong to not give him legal recognition as a woman. And it was this case that pushed forward for gender recognition in the UK. And of course, the fact that there was treatment. So hopefully, if the provision of treatment to undergo surgery and to get rid of sex characteristics is successful, perhaps judges will reconsider. But the sad truth is, with this case and everything that followed, gender became a thing in most European countries' laws. The CJEU, however, is a bit more interesting. The report itself repeatedly cites these cases from the Court of Justice of the European Union. For those of you here who are familiar with European hierarchy, the CJEU decides on matters of EU law, and it is supreme on those issues. So in this case, again, this person was not able to get married. And because they were not able to get married, they were not able to access their partner's pensions, everything. In this case, it was actually a woman who had undergone surgery and claimed to be in a relationship with a woman, but wanted to get married. And because of the lack of legislation allowing people from the same sex to marry, and what the CJEU basically said, this is a heterosexual couple and they want to get married. And because you're not giving them kind of legal gender recognition, they're not able to get married. So what they actually said in this case, KB versus National Health Services, is that you can't have legislation that prevents a heterosexual couple from getting married. However, what institutions like the EIGE use is to say that the CJEU said that this non-recognition of legal gender is against human rights. That's not actually what the CJEU said. In fact, in this judgment, in paragraph 33, the court clearly says it is up to national courts and national laws to decide whether to recognize the gender of a person. This case turns up in a lot of EU documents. It turns up in a lot of their propaganda to state that, the CJEU has said there should be legal recognition of gender, but it's not actually what the court said. There's also another case that they repeatedly use, Richard versus Secretary of State for Work. This guy basically wanted to retire at age 60 after undergoing surgery, which was the retirement age for women and not for men. And the Secretary of State for Work said, well, no, you're actually a male, so you can only retire at 65. And so he filed a case in the CJEU. In this case, it's not very good for us, because it says that if we're trying to bring about progressive equality in terms of in between men and women, then we have to include discrimination arising from gender reassignment, because this guy who had undergone surgery wanted to get his pension earlier. And this case, in fact, does state that the notion of gender equality must require a progressive implementation and uses Directive 79/7. I focused on these three cases because they are, of course, large sources of authority for reports like this. But and I did want to highlight that sometimes they twist what the case was about in order to make their own argument. But yeah, but in the report itself, as usual, there are contradictions. They state in page 11 that gender is a term to describe social cultural constructs. Congratulations on figuring out the obvious, I guess. And then they say that, oh, but there should be legal recognition of gender. So this is kind of the main line of attack we have with the legal committee, is to, aside from pushing that gender is not really a thing, it's also about the fact that these institutions, the independent expert Madrigal Bolos, the European Institute for Gender Equality, they contradict themselves. They use a definition of gender that is in line with feminist theory, that it is socio-cultural construct, and that it mainly associates with the roles assigned to men and women. And then in the very next paragraph or the next page, they go on to argue that there must be legal recognition of it. Because yes, one might argue that ethnicity, race, religion, they're all social constructs, but some definitions of gender that even, well, trans-friendly organizations use clearly state that it is about roles expected of and attributed to men and women. And then they turn around and argue that this should receive protection. This brings us also to the Istanbul Convention, which of course is the convention against violence against women. And that one does use a definition of gender as the socially constructed roles, behaviors that a given society considers appropriate for men and women. This is part of their general trend of contradictions. They use a definition of gender which is clearly restrictive and then say it should be included as a gender mainstreaming perspective. They use the word gender, gender identity, gender expression, all separately. They never mention a conflict between women's rights, any kind of women's rights. They simply state, they do acknowledge that there's something called an anti-gender movement. And as usual, they just claim that it is a right-wing thing and it's something that is located in a few specific countries within the EU. They're able to limit this opposition to certain countries like Poland and Hungary, which have slightly right-wing governments, and claim that the opposition is just there. They don't even they don't mention TERFs or a certain group of radical feminists or anyone like that. So I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. They also do note, however, that the European Network of Equality Bodies does say that there is a hierarchy in terms of grounds against anti-discrimination. So, like I said, Article 19 of the TFEU and another article in the TEU, the Treaty of the European Union, both have race and sex right in the beginning. They do not have gender. And the European Network of Equality Bodies does say that there's a hierarchy in terms of grounds for anti-discrimination law. Whether we can leverage this is a different question, but the report itself acknowledges it. So just to wrap up, it's not a very good report. They do acknowledge that there has been a shift. They try to twist a couple of the judgments that aren't as favorable to them as they present it to be. And they're still very confused. I wouldn't even say they're very confused. They pretend to use gender, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics all separately, as if the first three aren't the exact same thing. But at the same time, also use the definitions of gender that are quite regressive. So, well, we'll have to see where that goes. And hopefully we can use this to also oppose the EIG's push in terms of EU law. Thank you so much.
Have you got any ideas of what we should be doing?
If the EIG were actually in Brussels, it might actually be an idea to go protest in front of them, because the thing is, it's very convenient for the EU bodies as well as the UN to pretend like we don't exist, right? It's not even about calling us TERFs and demonizing us. Their approach is to just pretend like we don't exist. And the EIGE, of course, is just a think tank. Another alternative is, well, not an alternative really, but if one of the ongoing cases in any of the European countries were to fail, and if we were to go all the way up to the ECHR, because the problem here is Goodwin. Goodwin was decided a while ago and it has done a lot of damage. But I think now the ECHR is aware that their attempt to give a guy the right to marry has now spawned a much bigger monster. If we even get one victory at the CJEU level or at the ECHR level, that will make a big difference. But until we're there, the best option is less to sort of write reports to them, because we've been doing that now for 2 years and they just ignore us, and to, I guess, take more of a confrontational approach, and really just force the EU bodies to acknowledge that there are women and that this is a different kind of opposition, but also to sort of nail on their own inconsistencies. Like, you say gender is about roles and then you want legal recognition of gender. Like, make up your mind. What I do think, however, is that it's going to be very hard to roll back everything about gender. But what can also be done is to point out that using sex as to be expanded in equality of treatment is bad. But if you really want to protect gender expression or whatever, just keep it really far away from sex and use different language, because that's where I think the courts also get tripped up. They tend to fall into this trap of thinking it has to be under sex, and in the incentive to want to fix a blatantly unequal situation, that's part of what causes this chaos.